All right, guys, so as Israel is continuing to move forward with their final solution in Gaza, we now have new polling data on the American people, whose government has obviously been fully and totally complicit in everything that Israel has done over the last 2 years, now overwhelmingly turning against both Benjamin Netanyahu and the state of Israel. So a couple of different things that I want to get to here. We have new polling from Gallup, from CNN, also from Data for Progress, specifically in regards to Zohran Mandani and the positive role that him taking a strong stance against Israel's actions played in the New York City Democratic primary. And then we also have several new European countries that are at least considering recognizing a Palestinian state. So let's go ahead and start off here with CNN's Harry Enton on the flip that has happened in regards to both Israel, their actions in Gaza, and Benjamin Netanyahu specifically.
You know, Benjamin Netanyahu, if you look at polling in the United States, he is lost in the court of public opinion. I want you to take a look here at his net favorable rating. It is the lowest on record, according to Gallup, and they have records going all the way back since the 1990s. What are we talking about here? Well, in April of 2019, before, obviously, Israel in Gaza and the latest war that's been going on for a long time, Benjamin Netanyahu was on the positive side at plus 13 points. Look at where he is today, minus 23 points. My goodness gracious. You look at those under the age of 35, his net favorable rating at this point, get this, 53 points underwater. My God. And this, of course, has everything to do with Israel's actions in Gaza. The American people at this particular point not exactly liking what they're seeing, and they believe that Benjamin Netanyahu is in large part responsible.
So to that point, how do Americans feel about Israel's actions in Gaza right now?
Yeah, so let's take a look at this. I mean, net approval, Israel's military acts in Gaza. You go back to November of 2023, it's on the positive side of the ledger, plus 5 points. I bet if you even go back a little bit further, it'd be a little bit higher, but Gallup only measured in November of 2023 at plus 5 points. Look at here where we are in July of 2025. Way down there at minus 28 points. Among those under the age of 35, get this, a negative 73-point net approval rating. This is all being led. All the negative opinions towards Israel and their acts in Gaza are being led by the younger folks in the electorate. Negative 73 points on net approval rating. You rarely ever see numbers that low, and that is charging up this number, 28 points underwater. The net approval rating of Israel's military acts in Gaza. The American people do not like what they're seeing and increasingly dislike what they're seeing.
That is really a shift. And this is leading to a number of other feelings when it comes to Israel in general. As we look at that, and also questions about Palestinians and whether to recognize the state of Palestine, that's back in the news because of Emmanuel Macron. Where do we stand on some of those questions?
Yeah, so, for the longest period of time, Americans have sympathized more with the Israelis than the Palestinians. That's still the case, but it's only by plus 5. You go back to May of 2024, it was plus 17. Right after October 7th, look at this, it was plus 48. In 2017, it was plus 39 points. That is a dramatic drop. That is, what is that, a 43-point drop since the aftermath of October 7th. And again, under the age of 50, you look at those younger voters, it was plus 38 Israelis all the way back in 2017. You look now, it is plus 19 Palestinians. There has simply put been a complete change of opinion on this.
So the main thing that I glean from this, right, is this is obviously a generational fuck up from Israel. They have lost an entire generation of Americans, right? Young people, people under the age of 45, specifically in this poll. Or in this one, it's under the age of 49, from 18 to 49-year-olds. This went from plus 38 sympathy for Israelis over Palestinians to plus 19 for Palestinians. I mean, that is a gargantuan flip. Now, obviously, it shouldn't be surprising, given that young people disproportionately use social media. We have seen our social media feeds flooded with images, with pictures, with videos of dead children, people being blown to shreds, people lit on fire by some of the bombs that Israel has dropped on refugee camps, the images of Gaza from an overhead perspective, where it's just nothing but destruction. It shouldn't be surprising that we've ended up in this place. This is what we have seen our social media feeds filled with for nearly 2 years straight, as both the Israeli government and our government have been trying to justify it. So, of course, young people are going to be fed up with this and are not going to support it. I mean, again, from plus 38 in favor of Israelis to plus 19 in favor of Palestinians, even this one, it's a negative 73-point net approval for Israel's actions in Gaza, with under the age of 34-year-olds. And then on this first one here as well with Netanyahu, it's underwater by 53 points. It was plus 3 with 18 to 34-year-olds just back in 2019. He had a positive favorability, and now it's underwater by 53 points. I mean, this is absolutely massive, what we have witnessed over the last 2 years. Again, not surprising, but as pointed out here by Max Blumenthal, this is a serious reckoning, and this is something that Israel is going to have to deal with in the future. You've lost an entire generation that is now, increasingly over time, going to be rising to political power. So good luck with that. There is no coming back from this, right? This is the crime of all crimes. We're not going to see a post-Gaza scenario where everybody just sort of forgets and forgives and moves on. There needs to be a reckoning with the fundamental reality of Zionism, the fundamental reality of what Israel is doing, not just in Gaza, but as a broader settler colonial project towards Palestinians, the apartheid structure of Israel, the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, the total genocidal destruction in Gaza. This is not something you're going to be able to move on from. Okay, we are not going to forget this. We are not going to allow this to happen without accountability for those who perpetrated it, both in Israel and here in the United States as well. And that's clearly what young people are saying. Now we have another one here. This one is from Gallup. Jacob says here that American support for Israel's military campaign against Hamas, really it's against Gaza, but okay. He says is now at a new low at 32% still, and that's overall with the American people. 71% of Republicans still approve of it, obviously because it's what Trump is doing. They will go along with whatever Trump is doing. But with Democrats, it's at 8%. 8%, not 80, 8%. I mean, look at this fall off here in terms of the broad, both Democrats, Republicans, independents, in terms of approve and disapprove. You can see it fall off of a cliff here, especially recently in the last couple of months. And then you look at, again, Democrats specifically, it was only at 36% back, in late 2023, sort of right after October 7th. And then it's trickled down all the way here. I mean, by January, February, March of 2024, it was already down at 18%. Now it's all the way down at 8%. Now, moving on here, because again, we have some insights into Zohran, who just won the New York City Democratic primary, and he was trying to run his campaign centered on affordability. Now, many of his political opponents, both, people like Andrew Cuomo, but also people in the media, tried to make this more so about him being a rabid anti-Semite because he dared to have a principled and a moral and a stance that is in line with international law and with respect for human rights. They tried to smear him as an anti-Semite and to make this a core function of the campaign. And that backfired. We now have definitive polling data showing that, if anything, him standing firm on a much more aggressively anti-Israel stance actually helped him to build a coalition. This runs completely contrary to everything that Andrew Cuomo was saying, everything that the Democratic establishment was saying, and everything that the media was saying. So here from Forward, their headline is Mandani's criticism of Israel and support for Palestinians attracted voters, according to a new poll. So here they say, according to the post-primary survey of 531 voters conducted by Data for Progress, 78% of respondents agreed with Mandani's belief that Israel was committing a genocide in Gaza. 78% of these voters. They say 79% support restricting weapons to Israel, and 63% back his pledge to arrest Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu if he visits New York City, which is something that Zohran said that he would do and is something that he absolutely should do. Again, something that is in line with what is necessary under international law. He is a wanted fugitive war criminal. Obviously, the International Criminal Court issued those arrest warrants last year. And of course, they point out here in compliance with International Criminal Court's arrest warrants. But again, look at these numbers. 78% say that there's a genocide, 79% support restricting weapons, and 63%, an overwhelming majority, are okay with him arresting the Prime Minister of Israel. They continue down here. They say the poll conducted for the Institute for Middle East Understanding Policy Project via text to web from July 11th to the 17th showed that these stances indeed influenced support for Mandani. Among his voters, 62% said his support for Palestinian rights swayed their decision, so almost half, and 46% said the same about his willingness to criticize the Israeli government. The survey had a margin of error of 4 percentage points. So again, if anything, they say 62% said his support for Palestinian rights swayed their decision in a positive direction, and almost half said the same about his willingness to criticize Israel. So this is not an unpopular thing that we're talking about here, taking a firm stance against genocide. Shockingly, that's not an unpopular position to take. Final thing here, they say the poll showed that the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, often criticized for targeting critics of the Jewish state, has an unfavorable rating of 50%, with only 15% viewing it positively. Only 15% of New York City Democratic primary voters view AIPAC positively. Think about how much of a gargantuan swing this is against this kind of an organization who, to be clear, them along with the ADL absolutely deserve it. They have obliterated any sort of credibility that they may have had in the past. It's clear what they are. AIPAC exists essentially as a foreign lobbying organization to crush any leftists, any progressives who dare to criticize Israel. They spend millions, hundreds of millions of dollars over the course of primaries to remove progressive candidates from winning these elections. That's why they exist. They are an arm of the Israeli government, and people recognize that. When you are running around criticizing people and funding against people for simply criticizing a genocide, it's not going to reflect positively on your organization. And yes, of course, AIPAC needs to register as a foreign lobbying organization, as every other, lobbying wing for a foreign government would have to. Right? For some reason, there's an exception for AIPAC, but they absolutely should. And again, the same thing goes for the ADL. Guys like Jonathan Greenblatt just going around smearing, calling people anti-Semites, anybody who dares to have even the mildest critique of the government of Israel. You've obliterated your credibility. And here the numbers show that 15% view AIPAC positively. Now, contrast that importantly here with how many Democrats, especially at the national level, take money from AIPAC. I mean, it is overwhelming. I would dare to say it's a majority of Democrats that directly get support from AIPAC, with only 15%. Keep in mind also, this is the in terms of Jews around the world, this is the largest concentration of Jews in any city outside of Israel, is in New York City. That's the population of Jews in New York City is massive. And even then, it's 15% view AIPAC positively. They continue, though. They say it also found that just 16% of Democratic primary voters and 12% of adults under the age of 45 sympathize more with Israelis in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Again, this matches roughly with other numbers that we've covered before. And they say that matched with recent national polls that showed Democratic voters are increasingly sympathetic for Palestinians. And it aligned with the new Gallup poll that we just looked at that shows 60% of Americans surveyed now disapprove of Israel's military action in Gaza, with only 32% approving at a historic low. Now, as a part of these same numbers that we got from this same Data for Progress and IMEU poll, we also had this was interesting in terms of the net favorability among New York Democratic primary voters, with some key figures, obviously, in New York politics. Number one up here, overwhelmingly, the most highly favorable candidate or politician is AOC, right? The most leftist candidate in New York politics, next to Zohran Mandani, who is number two on this list as the most popular at plus 42% favorable. Hakeem Jeffries, the leader of the Democrats, is down less than half of where AOC is in New York, in his home state, at 27%. And then you also have Democrats in Congress broadly, which is sitting at just 17% favorable. And then you have Chuck Schumer, who's even lower at 7%. And then you have Andrew Cuomo, who just got his ass beat by Zohran in the primary and now is insisting on running again in the general, who is at minus 12. And then finally, Benjamin Netanyahu at minus 64. Minus 64. Keep in mind, Andrew Cuomo voluntarily signed up to be essentially a lawyer, a defender for Benjamin Netanyahu against the criminal charges that he is facing from the International Criminal Court. That's who Andrew Cuomo is aligning himself with, the guy at the bottom of this list, minus 64. I mean, we're talking about almost a mirror image to where AOC stands at the top of this poll. And they also mentioned down here that the mayoral race might play into some of these numbers. 57% of New York Democrats said that they would be less likely to support any congressional candidate next year who did not endorse Mandani for mayor, which includes a lot of the guys mentioned here, right? Has Hakeem Jeffries endorsed Zohran? No. Has Chuck Schumer endorsed Zohran? Don't think so. So, maybe this is something for them to reflect on. You have a majority of Democrats in your home state who are saying, I'm not going to support you next time around if you don't endorse Zohran Mandani, which should be the default, by the way. I mean, think about all of the vote blue no matter who that we had thrown in our face as the left over the last number of years when some corporate establishment, centrist candidate wins, the primary. Oh, you got to fall in line. You got to support them. You got to vote for them. And then when it happens in the reverse, they run a general election campaign against the guy who just won the Democratic primary. I mean, it's absurd. It would be as if Bernie Sanders had launched an independent run against Joe Biden and Donald Trump in 2020 after losing the Democratic primary. Can you imagine the hair on fire freak out that we would have seen from all of these people who are still not endorsing Zohran? I mean, it's just the double standards are outlandish at this point. And they also mentioned down here that 72% of those polled here favored candidates who would vote to withhold U.S. weapons from Israel. 72%. Overwhelming. We also had this here from Waleed Shahid. Top issues contributing to Mandani's support were lowering costs, taxing the wealthy, and support for Palestinian rights. So this was not a throwaway issue where people didn't really care one way or another, or maybe they generally supported his stance. No, this was a key issue in this race, and there's no denying that according to the numbers here. The question was, you indicated that you voted for Zohran Mandani in the 2025 Dem primary for mayor. For each of the following, state the extent to which it affected your decision to vote for him. His plans to lower cost was up here at 89%, saying it was important to me and swayed the way that I voted. Number 2 was his plans to tax the wealthy at 86%, and at 62%, it was his support for Palestinian rights. 62%. And, that 26% also comes into play here with people saying that it was important to them, but it didn't really necessarily sway them, but still overwhelmingly supported. 62% said that his principled stance against genocide and in favor of Palestinian human rights positively impacted, their stance on how they wanted to vote for him. Now, contrast that down here to Pete Buttigieg, who you could make a case is probably eyeing a 2028 run for president. And this was his analysis of Zohran Mamdani. I mean, this is just comical. He says, if Dems want lessons from Mamdani applicable across the country, it's less about the ideology and more about the message discipline of focusing on what people care about and the tactical wisdom of getting out there and talking to everybody. No, that's not actually it. And we know that based on the numbers up here, right? Ideology actually does matter. And it's not just any idea, it's economic populism works in these kinds of elections. Economic populism is popular. Shockingly, right? I know that's a shock to everybody out there, but to say it's not about ideology, so then what is it about? You think it's just about messaging? You think if Pete Buttigieg, running on basically nothing, maintaining the status quo, makes a few TikToks and he regurgitates the so-called abundance agenda a few times, that's going to work in the same way that it worked for Zohran? No, of course. Of course, it's about the policies. The policies absolutely matter first and foremost. Now, we also had, as part of these same polls that were coming out, here from Hamid Bendas, he says, think back to how many stories that there were on pro-Israel Dems angry at Zohran. Our poll found that there are 5.5% of the New York City electorate of voters who said increasing or maintaining support for Israel was a factor in their vote. 5.5% of people who voted in this primary said that maintaining support for Israel was a factor in their vote. I mean, that's almost nothing. And again, think about the amount of weight that was given to this perspective in the media of, during the debate, when he's standing on the debate stage and everybody else is saying, oh, the first place I'm going to go is to Israel. And the next guy says Israel. And then Zohran says, I'm going to stay here in New York City. And you had the debate moderators who I guess were there to just be like cheerleaders for genocide. And they say, well, do you support Israel's right to exist? Well, do you support Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state? And he stood on, 10 toes down. But again, it's just the environment that was created that centering Israel in a New York City Democratic primary was just absurd. When again, as they point out here, 5.5% of the electorate said that it was important to them that the mayor is maintaining support for Israel. It's almost nobody, right? I mean, absolutely insane. Now, in terms of where Zohran is going moving forward in the general election, keep in mind we have the Republican Curtis Sliwa, we have Andrew Cuomo, and then we also have Eric Adams. Both of these Democrats just totally disgraced, one the mayor and one the former governor. And it looks like the polling is heavily favoring Zohran in basically any way that you want to cut it. Here again from Jacob, he says, New York City mayor's race poll from Zenith Research and Public Progress Solutions. Mamdani is at 50% in a 5-person race. Cuomo's at 22%. Mamdani has a 52-40 lead over Cuomo in a head-to-head and a 59-32 over Adams in a head-to-head. So even if they dropped out and endorsed each other, which it doesn't seem that they're going to because they're all narcissists and would refuse to do that, but even if they did that, he still wins overwhelmingly in a head-to-head. I mean, it's really not even close. The closest one here is with Cuomo, and that's a 12-point gap, which is exactly, I believe, the same margin that he won the Democratic primary. So hopefully that continues, on its current trajectory, and Zohran does end up finishing the job there. But again, lesson for Democrats broadly around the country in terms of what the polls are showing, and how Zohran's win may show that you don't need to suck up to Benjamin Netanyahu. You don't need to fall in line with the, anti-Semitism smears and support everything that Israel does in order to be electorally effective. Now, to point out a couple of other things that have been happening in terms of the narrative shifting against Israel and people who used to be staunch defenders and supporters of Israel now turning against them. Just one thing here from Pod Save. These are the guys who used to work in Obama's circle, and they have this, pretty popular podcast now. And they have just completely turned against Israel at this point. So let's go ahead and watch a little bit of this clip from one of their recent episodes.
And I don't think Democratic candidates should take money from AIPAC or vote to fund military support for Israel anymore. Like, I really don't. In this government, absolutely not. And that especially includes, I think, the next Democratic nominee for president.
Things I want to see Democrats at least calling for is cutting off military assistance to Israel. Yep. It's a rich country, by the way. They don't need our $3 billion a year. And hands up, right? Barack Obama signed a 10-year MOU for $3.3 billion a year. So we're part of the problem here. Mm-hmm. Let's correct it. I would like to see talk about sanctioning Israeli government officials who use genocidal rhetoric or who talk about ethnic cleansing openly. We should support a ceasefire resolution at the UN. We should demand that international press be allowed into the Gaza Strip to report on what's happening without an IDF minder. It's insane. The press still can't go into Gaza and cover what's happening. And I also think there has to be a total mindset change in the Democratic Party. When the war ends, we are not going back to the pre-October 7th status quo because it's not where the party is.
So credit to them. They even admit that, under the Obama administration, he gave a massive, $3.3 billion per year deal to Israel. So they're admitting their mistakes. They're saying not only cut off the weapons to Israel, but there needs to be a total mindset shift in the Democratic Party. They're saying, even consider sanctioning Israel or Israeli officials that use genocidal language. So credit to these guys. I mean, again, would have liked to have seen this a while ago, but this is, again, an indication in terms of where even liberals are at within the Democratic Party at this point. Now, we move on to a couple of officials here, politicians, who seem to be getting in at the very final moment here as Israel is literally finishing the end of their genocide. And as, an overwhelming bulk of the population in Gaza is in stage 5 of famine and starvation, seems to be that they're trying to cover their asses a little bit at this point to, appear as though they are on the right side of history. So here we have from Barack Obama. He said, while a lasting resolution to the crisis in Gaza must involve a return of hostages and a cessation of Israel's military operations, these articles underscore the immediate need for action to be taken to prevent the travesty of innocent people dying of preventable starvation. We also had Hillary Clinton saying aid organizations report that thousands of children in Gaza are at risk of starvation, while trucks full of food sit waiting across the border. Calls for opening the flood of humanitarian assistance into Gaza. And then we also had Cory Booker here with this more lengthy, demand that something be done about the catastrophic hunger. But, what was noteworthy in this entire statement to me is that you do not see the mention of Israel a single time throughout this entire statement. This is the same Cory Booker who was recently pictured with Benjamin Netanyahu on his recent trip here to Washington, D.C. So for all of these people, it's way too little. It's way too late. You had the power to do something about this a very long time ago. And it seems like you're trying to check boxes in order to appear as though you were on the right side of history after, again, it is far, far, far too late at this point. Now, we move on here because it's also the media. Here we have, a man who used to work for AIPAC, Wolf Blitzer, doing a pretty solid segment here on how catastrophic the situation is in Gaza and even calling out some of the Israeli lies. So let's go ahead and watch a little bit of this segment here.
Our team is feeling the effects of the starvation themselves. Our team wakes up every morning just like everyone else, wondering where they're going to get their next meal. Some of the things we've heard mothers say to us that their children are asking if there's food in heaven, if that would be better. One team member talked about seeing a girl filling up water at a water tank right next to a sewage area. So standing in knee-deep sewage, trying to get clean water. We visit families and say everyone in the family has infections, scars, sicknesses, all that from lack of clean water, and on top of systems that are people that are depleted from lack of food.
Because we know that dozens and dozens of humanitarian groups are warning that doctors, journalists, aid workers are going hungry alongside what's going on in Gaza right now. And I know your team is having a tough time coping as well.
Yes, for sure. They're like everybody else. The little food that is available, that the March blockade that the Israelis put in also affected commercial goods. The little food that is available is extraordinarily expensive. Our team reported that a sack of flour was going for $480 in the marketplace. So it's just a tremendously dire situation.
UNICEF says that 80%, this is UNICEF, 80% of those who have died of starvation are children in Gaza. And now the enclave is on the brink of running out of specialized food that's needed to save these kids. What can aid groups like yours do with so little food and supplies on hand, at least right now?
Yeah, right now we are providing water and other services, but this is very solvable. It's man-made and it's solvable. We need a ceasefire. We need Israel. We need a resumption of the UN food distribution points and the UN aid distribution system, and we need unfettered access to get food in to serve people. At this point, when people are dying of deaths, this is a long process, and it's a weeks and months buildup. So you go from long-term nutrition deficit to severe malnutrition, ultimately death. At this point, people need more than food. They need malnutrition treatment. They need therapeutic foods. They need medical care. We need to go in with complete solutions to stop this from really tipping into a mass death event.
As you know, Jada, Israel says it stopped the previous aid distribution system because it claims Hamas was stealing so much of that food. What do you know about that?
We have seen no evidence of that, and there was a report today that a USAID investigation going back to 2023 saw no widespread evidence of that. But
Right, of course. And we've known that for a long time. Israel never provided any evidence whatsoever that Hamas was mass looting the aid. If anything, we did see from great reporting from Dropsite News, for example, and Jeremy Scahill and Ryan Grimm, that Israel has actually been partnering with ISIS-linked gangs inside of Gaza that have been, to a systematic level, looting some of the aid and then, putting it on the black market to sell for exorbitant prices. So, obviously that's been a lie from day one. It's rare that you see that kind of thing on CNN here. These are the kinds of lies that they would normally just regurgitate without a second thought, especially coming from, again, a guy like Wolf Blitzer, who used to work for AIPAC himself. So, you can see, at least to some extent, a tone shift that is happening at the upper levels here, even in U.S. media, where he's not, questioning her on everything that she's saying and trying to use the Hasbara talking points and use IDF talking points in order to question every little thing. No, at this point, it's very clear what's happening. They imposed a total blockade of humanitarian aid for months. People are starving to death at this point. It's reached stage 5 for a huge bulk of the population. And as she points out there, it's not even at this point just about getting food into Gaza. The malnutrition is so severe that you need experts, you need doctors, you need specialized treatments in order to recover from this kind of malnutrition. And even then, the lifelong impacts are going to be drastic for basically the entire population of Gaza. So, again, too little, too late, but you can see at least here from a network like CNN that the tone is shifting. We also have seen, at least in some rare instances, some great reporting from the BBC, which has been one of Israel's greatest cheerleaders throughout this genocide. And the BBC is allowing stories like this at this point, where we had Jeremy Bowen saying that Israelis don't want us to film outside the window over Gaza at the devastation that he's seeing. Communities in the north of Gaza are flat. There's nothing left. Israel will not allow reporters like myself to enter Gaza to report the story, and they don't want us to see it. And this has been obviously consistent throughout the entirety of this genocide. They have never for one day allowed foreign journalists to independently operate inside of Gaza, and it's very clear why they're doing it, because they, as he points out here, don't want the world to see the atrocities that they have committed. Now, fortunately, we have brave Palestinian journalists that have been slaughtered at a historic, unprecedented scale inside of Gaza, who still get the stories out even to this day and still get some of the images and the videos out. But, obviously, foreign journalists also need to be allowed to operate inside of Gaza without being targeted by Israel. Now, moving on here to the last couple of things, we do have some updates in terms of the foreign governments within Europe specifically, potentially moving towards recognizing a Palestinian state. So there's two different things going on here. Number one, is it seems like Macron in France are moving towards just straight up recognizing a Palestinian state. They had a 3-day conference at the United Nations with the goal, as they say here from The Guardian, as part of a peaceful settlement to end the war in Gaza, as well as moving forward with recognizing a Palestinian state. In response to this, of course, we had Ambassador Mike Huckabee, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, saying that France recognizing Palestine as a state is, quote, like letting Nazis have a victory after World War II, which is an interesting thing to say, right? His argument is that Hamas did October 7th, and by recognizing Palestine as a state, you're rewarding them for that and basically approving it. But let's flip that on its head for a second, right? What does it say about the Israeli government and their credibility to exist as they currently do, given what we've seen both before, but especially since October 7th? You cannot possibly say that Palestine cannot have a state because of October 7th, but Israel can, given what they've done after October 7th. I mean, the scale of the atrocities and the crimes is incomparable to anything that happened on October 7th. I mean, in fact, it was only a week after October 7th that Israel had already killed more civilians than were killed on October 7th. So just a ridiculous, farcical argument being put forward here, if you can even call it that, from Mike Huckabee, especially given that, you know, Zionism ideologically is much closer to Nazism than anything. But, you know, this is what his response is, obviously freaking out at the concept of recognizing the basic right of Palestinians to have autonomy and statehood as they deserve under international law. Now, I saved this for a second because this one is almost more insulting than anything. We had Keir Starmer from the UK, the Prime Minister, obviously, and he came out and said, we might recognize a Palestinian state, but we're only going to do that if Israel doesn't agree to a ceasefire. So he is essentially dangling this, again, fundamental right that Palestinians absolutely deserve and need to have autonomy, to have a state, to have an end to the decades-long occupation from Israel. And he's using this as sort of a dangling bargaining chip with Israel to say, if you don't stop, then we're going to recognize a Palestinian state as sort of like a punishment, right? He's framing a Palestinian state as a punishment to Israel instead of just as something that they deserve. I mean, this is just grotesque. As pointed out here by Prem, he says this is somehow even more offensive. Palestinian people either get a state or they get to not be mass bombed every day. You only get one, according to Keir Starmer. Now, final thing here. I do think it's important to point out the politicians, the very small handful of politicians who have been there since day one, calling this out, including people obviously like Rashida Tlaib, who was recently outside of Congress saying that we must continue to push for a complete arms embargo of all weapons to the Israeli government, no matter what weapons. I don't care if it's offensive or defensive, which is sort of a bullshit distinction that politicians, especially liberal politicians, make to try to justify continued military support for Israel. She says it's past time that my colleagues stop making excuses. And credit to Rashida Tlaib. You know, this is somebody who has been attacked and smeared and vilified and literally censured by Congress for daring to stand up for Palestinian rights, for human rights, for international law. So credit to the ones who have been very consistent on this since the beginning. And another reason why I bring her up is that, you know, notice the discrepancy between the polling that we witnessed at the beginning of this video, showing that overwhelming numbers of especially Democrats, but even broadly among the American people, that they want to cut off weapons to Israel. Right? They want to see a forceful end to this genocide, an end to the occupation, an end to the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank as well. They don't support Benjamin Netanyahu. They don't support the Israeli government. They don't support what Israel is doing in Gaza. And they also don't support AIPAC, by the way. And then contrast that with our elected representatives. There are still to this day only about 10 members of Congress who have called what Israel is doing in Gaza a genocide. Only about 10 out of over 500 that we have in the House and the Senate. It's about 10 who have called it a genocide. So contrast that to the polling we just showed. Overwhelming numbers of Democrats say, yes, it's a genocide, and yes, cut off weapons to Israel. So there still is this massive, massive disconnect, in large part because of lobbying organizations like AIPAC, by the way. But there is this massive disconnect between the Democratic Party base and the Democratic Party establishment. And at some point, that's going to have to break. Fortunately, I think we saw the initial stages of that break, that crack, with the election overwhelmingly of Zohran Mandani. Again, the polling data showing that, if anything, standing up against Israel helped him in that election. So I think that's the beginning of the dam breaking on this issue. And as time goes on, with the massive generational shift that we're seeing from young voters against Israel, this is something that Israel is going to have to grapple with in the long term, because there's no coming back from this. Young people, especially, but broadly the American people, are totally done with you, and for good reason, to say the least.
Politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying